especially when someone feels beaten down over and over and over again. Such a valid question. What do you think about that, Sherry?
My first thought here is this sounds like fatigue. And this just, and knowing when it's time to take a rest. And then I was talking to one person who told me she was afraid to rest because she was afraid she'd never get back up again. She was afraid that if she stopped, that would be it. And, my first thought is compassion, some compassion for being that fatigued, that exhausted. And the nice thing is compassion and permission don't have to be the same thing. I'm going to think about what I would say to myself in the mirror here, because I don't know Fryer's particular situation. So, but if I were to be looking at myself in this situation, I'd probably be saying, okay, honey, this is where you're at. This is how you're feeling. And acknowledging that doesn't mean I then give myself permission to give up and not go through and do anything. But often I need permission to pull back. I need permission to pull back and look at what's the non-negotiables and what are the negotiables, and realize that I often have a lot of non-negotiables that are on the negotiable. A lot of negotiables that I put on my non-negotiable list, things that God has not required me to do or asked me to do, but I act like I have to do them or else the world will end. So that's my first thought. How about you, Michelle?
Well, I was thinking about this whole idea of feeling guilt over fear. We tend to feel guilty for being afraid, as if the fear response is that means something's wrong with us. And I just don't believe that anymore. I believe that fear is a human response to frightening circumstances. I mean, let's just be honest. This human life can be terrifying at times. We're not, our fears are usually not in the weather and, what we're going to have for dinner tonight or whatever. I mean, our fears are often rooted in very significant and legitimate, very valid causes. And so then when we feel guilty for being afraid, that just compounds the whole process of working through our fear. And so sometimes I think when I feel beaten down over and over again, it's because I'm beating myself up over my fear. And my fear then becomes just another way that I feel like I'm failing, and that doesn't help anything.
And asking yourself maybe what's wrong with me.
Yeah. Oh, that's my go-to question. What's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? And I don't think it's the right question.
No.
So one thing I'm slowly learning to do is not to compound my fear with guilt, but to allow it to be what it is. I mean, let's be honest. One of my real fears right now is I'm no longer afraid of dying. So I face life and death. I've faced death 3 times now in the past 5.5 years. So dying is not something I'm afraid of. However, there's a very real fear that if the cancer comes back, the amount of pain and suffering would be unbearable. I've had a taste of that in the last year, and I can't bear the thought of that kind of pain again. So that's fear. Now, do I need to feel guilty about being afraid of that? Heck no, that's a valid fear. I have every reason to feel some apprehension about that possibility. However, I don't want to stay in that place. And so I want to process through somehow and to build some kind of framework to be able to process through this fear so it doesn't become paralyzing or debilitating, but is something that I can work through. I don't want to feel afraid all the time, in other words. So, Friar Wade, that's such a good question. Thank you so much for asking that one. I think there's so much more we could talk about on that same subject. I have another question here. I'm not sure if, here we go. It's in the, by the way, for those who are here, if you have a question, don't be afraid to ask it. Put it in that sidebar. You can use /Q to put your question in that sidebar. Then it populates over on my left sidebar so that I can see it. One of the questions that a woman asked me this morning was a question based on the very first verse that I quoted in the first email that went out on Monday was Psalm 112:7. Let me see if I can find it really quick. I think. Oh, yes. Psalm 112:7. He will have no fear of bad news. His heart is steadfast, trusting in the Lord. And her question was similar to what we just talked about. She read that verse and immediately felt like she's failing because it says he will have no fear of bad news. And she goes, well, I have fear of bad news every day. So what am I doing wrong? Do I just need to read my Bible more? Does this mean I'm not measuring up, or that my faith is small, or my faith is weak, since I still fear bad news? And my response to her, actually, I thought her question was really good. And so I pulled out a keyword study Bible, which actually gives the original meaning of the words in Hebrew, which is always a little dangerous for me. I think I need everybody to know I'm not a Bible scholar or a theologian. However, I really wanted to understand the heart behind it. And in both verse 7 and verse 8, when it talks about having no fear, the word that's used there is yare, and it has dual meanings. Okay, yare can be used in two ways. It's either fear in terms of fear of something hard or difficult circumstances, or fear in terms of reverence and awe of a powerful God. And so to me, those verses aren't so much about an either or situation. Either you have faith and aren't afraid, or you don't have faith and you are afraid, but more of a really powerful contrast between having our fear rooted in our circumstances and our fear or awe or reverence in a very powerful God. And it creates this beautiful contrast between the two, and the goal being that we aspire to move from one toward the other, which is a lifelong process, right?
Absolutely. No, that's great.
So that was an interesting insight for me as well.
You know, one of the things that came up in the Facebook group was what to do with the physical responses of fear, that sometimes our head is in the right place, but our hands are still shaking, or we've got the tight shoulders or whatever else. And, you know, one of the things I realized a few years ago, I've struggled with anxiety, which I know isn't the same thing as fear, but it's related to fear. And there was, you know, I've made a lot of strides in learning to, you know, cast all my cares upon him. And there's certain scriptures I go through, and there's, and I'd made a lot of progress with that. And one particular evening, I remember I was actually sitting right here at this table, and I was just feeling more and more anxious. And so I started reciting the scripture. I started praying, and it just wasn't what I was getting used to. Wasn't happening. And I'm like, oh, great. My faith is getting weaker, and I'm going backwards. This is terrible. And so I'm praying harder. I go grab the Bible. I'm, you know, and of course, you know, what's wrong with me is starting to play in the back of my head. And finally, I don't know, I was probably 10, 15 minutes into it, and I realized I was cold. My feet were cold. I was wearing flip-flops, but the weather had changed. And so my feet were literally cold. I wasn't anxious. I was having a physical reaction that often accompanies anxiety. And that physical reaction was then triggering the feeling of anxiety. So I went upstairs, I put socks on. In 15 minutes, I was fine. And so there's I think sometimes a reciprocal relationship between those physical manifestations of fear or anxiety or worry or whatever word we want to use. We'll just use fear for today. I think sometimes taking care of the physical can help take care of the emotional. Sometimes we need sleep. And I know there's many of us who we stay up late at night and we're trying to get sleep, but we can't. And so then we start avoiding it. At least I do. You know, I don't try to nap, because then I'm going to, you know, it'll ruin my sleep at night. But then at night I'm laying awake. Okay. So then when I put myself on project status, I'm going to get some sleep here, because that lack of sleep is just exacerbating the fears. Or nutrition or exercise or just some of those other basic physical care components. Do they solve everything instantly? Of course not. But I think they're a component that we often we miss.
Yeah, it's definitely a piece of the equation. I don't think they're complete in and of themselves, as you just said, but definitely a big piece of it. The other thing I've learned too, I used to be a nurse in my former life. So there is such a very scientific aspect to this whole idea of fear. And then when we have how should I say, practice fear again and again, we become very adept at fear. We actually develop very memory-like responses in our actual physicality that responds to fear in those ways. And so even being aware of that is a big piece of processing through fear. A couple things that I talked about in the post today, things that are helping me. Let's see if I can open that up today. Things that are helping me process through fear, which is just a huge piece of my day-to-day life, is changing my perspective on some things. I mentioned this earlier, my story about building a bigger boat. One of the things that's really helping me is to have more of a global awareness, because I have learned that when it comes to suffering, and actually I read this recently in Dr. Timothy Keller's book, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. Excellent, excellent book. But we as Americans are probably the least equipped to deal with trauma and suffering and fear, because we have almost this expectation of a good life and comfort. And so when something happens, it really wrecks us and shakes us, because from the beginning of our lives, we've been trained that if we work hard enough or do the right things or ask enough times, we can get what we want. And so then when that doesn't happen, we go back to that question, which you mentioned about what's wrong with me? What am I not doing right? Or if we don't ask about what's wrong with us, we're like, what's wrong with God that he's not doing what I'm asking him to do? And so having more of a global awareness of the fact that suffering is not unique to me, but it's everywhere. And that suffering is pretty significant and profound all over the world. There's really nobody immune to it. And even though that's heartbreaking on one hand, it's also very comforting to know that we're not alone in it. It actually helps create a sense of presence and community rather than isolation. Have you noticed that at all, Sherry?
You know, I grew up in a family where pain and suffering was just not talked about, because my mother, I'll use the term worry. She probably would not have recognized the term fear, but she was one who planned for every possible contingency. If it could possibly happen, she was already, way in advance preventing it from happening. And the problem with that is that often the things she worried about weren't going to happen anyways. So she had a reinforcement error. When they didn't happen, then she believed she had prevented them. And so the goal was always prevention, 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 never acknowledging and then learning to deal with it. I'm trying to think of any time that we actually dealt with pain as a family. I'm coming up completely blank. I remember when my dog got killed, hit by a car in 6th grade, and she sent a note to the teacher saying, Sherry may not be her normal, happy self today. I mean, that is all I remember. And I'm not saying that to slam her. I mean, we come from German stock. We are a thinking family, not a feeling family. But then just in terms of learning how to then walk other people through, it's hard to do that when you don't know how to do it yourself. And
absolutely,
that's what Undone has been so helpful for, is I want to be able to be there for others, and I'm having to learn how to do it for myself first.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting thing. If we are so bottled down by our fear of, or our guilt over being afraid, then we never process through it, which means we make it harder for other people to do as well. I mean, at some point we have to just allow it to be what it is. Not that we stay there, but not being afraid to just acknowledge it and give it our attention, acknowledge that it's the elephant in the room and that there's some valid reasons for it, and then figure out ways to talk through it and process through it. Susan asked a question, which I'm going to add here so y'all can see it, because it fits with what you were saying. What do you do if you are trying to work through your illness situation, but family tells you to suck it up and walk it off? I try to just ignore it, but I can't. I have also been told that if I didn't think about it, that it would go away. Unfortunately, what I think is happening there is what I like to call almost a secondary fear. When we see people who are suffering, it makes us afraid because we know it could happen to us. Mm-hmm. And so in very unhelpful ways, we shut down that suffering and we shut ourselves off from that pain by telling people to suck it up and walk it off, because we are so frightened about the truth that it could happen to us. The hard thing is, and I've noticed this even a little bit this week on our Facebook conversation on Undone Life Together, is listening to and processing with another person's suffering causes us to suffer a little bit too. It's not easy being present to somebody else's pain. I mean, it's just not. And so our temptation is to shy away, to shut it down, to ignore it, or try to fix it. And unfortunately, none of those things help the other person or teach us a thing about what it looks like to walk through fear and to be able to process through fear in a healthy way. And unfortunately, Susan, your situation, first of all, you're so not alone. I know that there are probably most of the people who are participating in this conversation right now have experienced this very, very thing. So you're definitely not alone in it. The problem is we can't do anything about changing another person's behavior. I mean, we can't change it. The good news is you can become someone who doesn't repeat it. You know, you can be someone who doesn't reciprocate that kind of response to another person's fear. How you deal with it in that moment, I mean, the same thing that probably Sherry has had to do and I've had to do is at some point I have to disregard their well-intentioned advice, not become bitter because of it, but just know it's well-intentioned, not helpful, and stay focused on my own journey and be true to my own journey. And that takes some additional strength and courage, but it helps when you come and participate in a conversation like this, because then you know you're not alone.
Well, you know, finding safe people who get it. I read an article last week that I'm still kind of reeling from that said that some husbands, not all, I'm not yet, but some husbands are not motivated by their wife's pain. They're only motivated by their own pain. And boy, a whole lot of things in my last 30 years suddenly made a lot of sense. But then I started applying that to other relationships. And I thought, yeah, most of us really are motivated by our own pain. And so what it sounds like is that these family members, you know, they feel bad and they want to stop feeling bad and don't have the skill set to know how to, what's the phrase, to hold space for somebody else's pain. I mean, I heard that phrase for the first time probably 5 years ago. I had no idea what it meant. The whole idea of being there, my personality type is a doing type. And so
I'll make you a casserole before I'll sit and listen to you tell me all about your pain.
Yeah. Yeah.
I get
that. You know, part of what I'm slowly developing, I guess I'm hung up on compassion today, is I used to be so angry when people didn't respond to me the way I wanted them to and needed them to.
Yes.
And I'm slowly developing a compassion. Now, it's easier to be compassionate when I'm not feeling any pain or a great deal of need, but realizing, you know, we're all doing the absolute best we can.
Yeah.
And then it's up to me to go seek people who can offer what I need in the situation. Because I used to hold the people I was close to hostage. You are going to meet my need, or no, they're not.
Well, exactly. I was thinking of that as you were talking, that we keep bumping our heads against the same wall, expecting a different response. I mean, we just keep going back to the same people, begging them to give us what we need. And then we get more disappointed and more frustrated and more angry that they're not able to meet it. Instead, let's find the safe person, the safe relationship, the safe space in order to get those needs met. And spiritually speaking, I know this is going to come out sounding very churchy, but it's just reality. The only person that will never fail us is God himself. I mean, that's it. He's the only person that is secure enough in himself and confident enough in his sovereignty and his ability to make all things work out for good, that he's not put off by our pain. He's not afraid of our fear. He's not afraid of our hard stories. So he doesn't shirk away and back up or try to fix it or ignore it. He is the only one that's fully able to be fully present to it because he knows how the story ends. So if we don't start there, we're always going to end up disappointed. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't have good relationships that help us walk through our fear, but it has to be rooted there. That's kind of what the point of the blog post was about today. We have to have a bigger boat. If our only boat of safety is our spouse or our best friend or even our church, you know, churches are full of imperfect people, we will be disappointed. All right. For those of you who are joining us, once again, we're going to be on for about 10 more minutes here. If you have a question on this subject of fear, don't hesitate to add it in the sidebar. You can use /Q to type your question in that right sidebar, and then it sends it over to me so I see it. Or you can call in. We have an open seat. So there should be a place where you can click on and call in. You can ask your question live and just join this conversation with Sherry and I. We would love to hear what you have to say about this. One other thing that happened this morning, which is I find very ironic, but I don't think it was accidental, is I went for a long walk right before we started this blab session. And one of my favorite things to do while I go for a run or a walk is to listen to podcasts. And this morning I happened to listen to a sermon by John Piper. Do you ever listen to sermons by him?
Can't remember.
Okay. Well, I listened to a sermon by him today based on Psalm 16, which is a psalm of David. And it starts out, the first words of the psalm are, keep me safe, oh God. In other words, it sounds like my prayers of, oh God, help, I'm scared. So it starts out with that kind of plea, that kind of panic, and that sense of terror because life is unpredictable and scary. And anyway, Piper went through this whole process of deconstructing that psalm and walking through David's process. And David starts at this kind of panicked plea of deliverance because he's afraid. It's that panic is rooted in fear. But then he goes through and acknowledges 4 different qualities about his God. And this whole psalm, by the way, is a prayer. The first quality of God he acknowledges is that God is his refuge. God is his safe place. And then the next thing he acknowledges is that God is his sovereign. So God is his Lord. God is sovereign. He kind of puts himself in this position of trusting God's sovereignty over his life. He acknowledges that. And then the third quality he mentions is that God is his treasure. So out of all the things on earth, material, relationships, otherwise, his supreme treasure is God. And he just says that out loud. God, you are my treasure. And you can see all of this if we walk through the Psalm 16. And then finally, the fourth quality of God is that God is his counselor. So when he doesn't have an answer, when he doesn't know what to do, he can trust the fact that God will be the one who whispers in his ear and counsels him along the way. And through the process of this psalm, so he starts out in verse 1 with this kind of panicked plea. He ends up in verse 8 saying, I have set the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I will not be shaken. So he moves very clearly in 8 verses between panic to confidence. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't have fear still, but he was able to process through from a place of, God help, to, because you are at my right hand, I will not be shaken. And so Piper, again, this isn't my material. This is Piper's sermon, actually God's material, Piper's sermon. But what I thought was so interesting is it gave a really good framework for moving from a place of fear to a place of peace. That doesn't mean an absence of fear, but a security or a slab of cement to stand on in the middle of our fear, where we can truly say, I am confident. And ultimately, it comes down to rehearsing what you believe to be what you believe to be true about God, that he's our refuge, he's our sovereign, he's our treasure, our ultimate treasure, and our counselor along the way. And for me personally, as I learned to deal with the fact that I may not live to be 85 years old, those things are the only thing that have made a difference for me. I mean, it really is. I exercise and I eat well and I do all that other stuff, but the real anchor of my process to overcome fear is that right there in a nutshell. All right. Alexis Design said it's really hard to hear what God is saying back to me. Alexis, I agree. I many times have asked God to buy a memo board or something like that so I could really understand more clearly what he's trying to say. Wouldn't that be nice? It is so hard, especially when we're paralyzed by fear. How do you process through your fear, Sherry? What helps you the most?
You know, when I saw her question, I'm probably not going to pronounce this right, but there's a practice called Lectio Divina. Am I saying it right? It's basically spiritual reading of scripture. And I was introduced to it probably 5 years ago at a retreat. And it actually, this one, the leader read the scriptures to us, and it was going through the same scripture passage. In this case, it happened to be the story of the woman who came and washed Jesus' feet. And the first time through, we were asked to just listen to it and sense if God was speaking to us in any way. The second time through, then to focus on a particular word, and was God inviting us to anything? And I don't remember the exact steps of the third and fourth, but I knew I had gone to that retreat. I was very afraid at that point about what was happening in my marriage. Not that anything bad was happening, but I was really afraid that we were in a bad spot because my husband wasn't meeting my needs, or expectations is really the word. I think a lot of our fears can come from expectations that we don't even realize we have. And as we went through that whole passage, the invitation that I sensed from God was to take my tears and my pain to his feet, and to quit trying to take them to my husband, because he couldn't handle them. His shoulders were not broad enough for that. And that I was trying to turn my husband into my savior. So I had a real conviction on that. But then this just very comforting invitation to remember to always take my tears to him. And, what that required was time. It required a period of probably 15 to 20 minutes to just really sit and seep in scripture, and just really spend time listening. And these were words I'm familiar with. I grew up with these stories. I memorized and got the gold stars for the memory verses on these stories. But really listening in a space of quiet, and really expecting, okay, it was the first time I'd done this. It seemed a little weird to me. God speaking to me. What am I going to hear? But it was such a strong impression that I had. And it was exactly what I needed at that moment, in ways it definitely wasn't when I had first memorized the passages or seen them on flannel boards as a child. And I have found that to be very true ever since. Is it always something that dramatic? No. But when I do block out the time that I might have spent worrying and being scared and, heading to the kitchen and feeding my face as a way of stuffing down the feelings of fear, when I do block out that time and I say, okay, God, instead of expectation, I'm going to have anticipation that you're going to have a message for me. And it may show up in the moment, or it may show up then later in a song and, something I see on TV and a conversation with a friend. But it has never failed that he speaks in some way through all of that. How about
Absolutely. You? Well, I was just going to say that this is a very embarrassing admission. I've been a person of faith as long as I can remember. My parents came to faith when I was about 6 months old. So I don't ever remember not being at church and having conversations about God and knowing the Bible. However, prayer has probably been probably the least tapped resource in my life up until the last couple of years. And the reason for that's very simple. I'm a doer. So it's much easier to read my Bible and check that off my list as a good to do. Prayer is, it seems so nebulous. It seems so untangible in many ways that it's a very hard thing for me to learn to do, to sit and to listen, to pour out my request. Now, I'm really good at, praying in a panic while I'm driving around town or something like that. But I'm talking about making this practice of daily prayer and giving presence or creating space for God's presence to be there and to speak. And over the last couple of years, that absence or that untapped resource became very obvious the more difficult it was for me to deal with my fear. And so at one point in time, I made a commitment to 15 minutes a day at the beginning of the day to just go into my room and sit on the floor behind my bed. I have to hide behind my bed so my kids can't find me. Behind my bed and just have 15 minutes of silence. I wouldn't let myself write my prayers down. I just had to sit there in silence because otherwise I would make it a to-do. And what happened in that, I committed for 30 days and I actually kept my commitment, which is quite amazing. After about 2 weeks, the first 2 weeks were very hard. After about 2 to 3 weeks, I couldn't wait to go to my bedroom. I could not wait. It became, I almost was desperate to escape life and to go sit up there and just have that quiet time. It's not like I heard God speak audibly, but it was powerful.
So that new pattern was establishing in your brain. You were replacing the old fear patterns, neural pathways with the new, and that takes time, but the rewards show up.
Absolutely. Now, what I found is the busyness of life and the responsibilities of life push out that new pattern very
Yeah.
easily. So I've had to recommit and do the 30 days again to get back into that. Uh, the thing is you and I don't want to wait for the storm to hit to develop that bigger boat, that bigger habit, right? If you wait until the crisis, you will have panic and you will have sleepless nights, and I mean, it will be unbearable. I know because I've been there. But when you invest now in building that bigger boat, then you're that much more prepared.
You know, Di Mooch has a great comment here. She said, sanctuary is probably what you're looking for. And I think that's what you just described is sanctuary.
Yeah,
And
sanctuary.
that's what the bigger boat is, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly it. We settle for two small boats all the time. We put all of our hopes into very small boats, and we definitely need something bigger. Not that the storm won't come; it will come. We just need a bigger boat. By the way, as a side note for those of you who are watching, we put links to both the John Piper sermon on Psalm 16, which I found to be very helpful in giving me a practical process to walk through my moments or days or seasons of fear, as well as the link to explain more about Lecto Divina. Divina, did I say that right?
I still don't know if I pronounce it right, but I have some other
Okay.
links. Thank you, by the way, Friar, for the link. And I have some from a ministry called Soul Shepherding. He's got a whole list of wonderful links to go through for that. And I'll learn how to pronounce it.
Maybe before next week when we do our conversation. In short, this conversation today, again, has been about fear, and a couple highlights just to recap before we close for today. First of all, fear isn't a sign that you're failing. I just don't believe it is. I think fear is a sign that you're human. And our human experience is a terrifying thing. Jesus said very clearly in the New Testament, in this world, you will have trouble, period. I mean, there's really not might, not could. It's in this world, you will have trouble. It's going to be scary at times. There's no way to avoid that. And a lot of times the things that we are afraid of happening, we're afraid of because the reality is bad things can and sometimes will happen. So fear doesn't mean you're failing. And I don't think that fear means a lack of faith either. I just think it's often fear is a process to deepen and develop our faith if we're willing to see it through, if we're willing to push through it. And so the point today is hopefully to alleviate some of our guilt related to our fear, because that doesn't help anything, but also to provide some practical insights and strategies to how we can cope with fear, which is both a physical response as well as an emotional response to very real life circumstances. And some of the best tools for you and I to kind of go back and process through are that Psalm 16, which gives us a really good framework through David on how to process through fear through our prayers. And then I left some suggestions on the blog post that I wrote today about fear that would hopefully be helpful to you. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We will be back here next Wednesday, again, talking about the hot topics related to Unlife Together, a 5-week conversation about the unexpected life. Who knows what that hot topic will be? It will, we'll leave it as a little bit of a mystery. That makes it more fun. But we'd love to see you back here next Wednesday at 10 a.m. Mountain Time, noon Eastern Time, and you can participate in this ongoing conversation about the unexpected life. Thanks for being here, Sherry. You have great insight. I love your perspective.
Oh, thank you. Is it weird to say this was really fun? And I was really excited to get up this morning and talk about fear. Oh my goodness. But thank you, Michelle, for going first and inviting us into a conversation that a lot of us need to have, but we don't have anybody else to have it with. So thank you for creating a safe space and for holding space for all of us.
Well, fear is like the monster in the closet. It's time to shine some light on it and shrink it down to size. And hopefully we've done that for everybody just a little bit today. Have a great day, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Righty.